So here we are with the joints of the foot and the ankle. We have to keep in mind when we're looking and talking about the ankle is that there are a number of joints that need to be considered as part of the ankle. And when I look at the foot, remember we've got 26 bones that create those articulations in the foot. So every muscle that we can identify both extrinsically and intrinsically in the foot and the ankle are multi-joint muscles. Everything is going to cross more than one joint at a time. So let's start looking at the complexity of the ankle and its just remarkable opportunity that it provides us to propel ourselves forward, to jump up and slam a basketball, to ski down a mountain in a stable boot, and all the intricate motions and the influence that it has all the way up the kinetic chain. So I'll start talking about the ankle proper, which really is the talocrural joint. The proximal articulation is what I like to, and many authors like to say is an ankle mortise, and the articulation between the distal tib fib and which creates the articulating surface of the tibia and of the fibula. We end up with almost a wrench-shaped joint that fits over the dome of the talus. Now, what stabilizes this and what type of joint is this? Well, the tib fib is a syndesmosis, and if I look up in this area, I can see the distal anterior tibiofibular ligament, which provides that stability and creates the mortise. Now, there is motion that occurs within this tib fib joint during dorsiflexion, and when we look at the shape of the talus and the articulating surface of the talus, we'll see why there is a need for motion to occur at this joint. So if I look at the articulating surface of the talus in two different views, we can see that I have a convex surface that is articulating with the concave surface of the mortise. Then looking at it from side to side, I can see that the anterior aspect of the articulating surface, or the dome, is wider than the posterior surface. So as I drop down into plantar flexion, I have a smaller surface, articular surface, articulating in the mortise, which will result in less articular contact. So in that decreased articular contact is really where that joint becomes positioned in its open chain position, or its open pack position. So as I move into dorsiflexion, and that wider dome articulates with the surface of the ankle mortise, it creates a greater contact. I have more stability and hence the closed pack position of the joint. So closed pack position of the joint tends to be dorsiflexion. Open packed position of the joint tends to be plantar flexion. Now, because I have a convex surface during open chain plantar flexion, and as my foot moves into plantar flexion, so as it moves down, the roll and the glide are going to be in the same direction. But that's not really how that joint functions. It really functions when your foot hits the ground and your tibia rolls over the top of it. So that would be the example of the moving concave over a fixed convex surface. so the roll and the glide are in the same direction. The ligaments that support the talocrural joint are medial and lateral, and the medial is the deltoid ligament, and it is made up as a combination of the calcaneotibial ligament, the anterior talotibial ligament, the tibionavicular ligament, the calcaneotib, the posterior talotibial, and the plantar calcaneonavicular ligament. We're going to come back and kind of visit that plantar calcaneonavicular ligament, which I really don't consider to be part of the deltoid ligament, but a separate inferior stabilizing structure. The lateral aspect, the ligaments are not blended together quite like they are on the medial aspect, and hence the ligaments tend to be a little bit more abused on that lateral side. So when I look at the anterior lateral side, the anterior talofibular ligament is the most prominent, followed by the calcaneofibular ligament and the posterior talofibular ligament. So those three make up the lateral stabilizing ligaments in the ankle. Now, one of the other components that will stabilize the ankle is the orientation of the fibula and the tibia. And when I look at the extent that the fibula extends distally, is it that bone extends distally quite a bit further than the tibia does. So the fibular aspect of the ankle is more stable just because I have a bony block. So my opportunity to move into eversion is less, not just because of the restriction from the deltoid ligament, but also from a bony block on the lateral side. So when I'm talking about the joint axis of the talocrural joint, it really helps us to describe what the motion of the ankle is really like. And if I look at the axis from a sagittal plane, it is oriented roughly 84 degrees plus or minus 7 degrees, and so it's not perfectly in the frontal plane, so it's offset a little bit, as is from a vertical position. It's oriented about 80 degrees, and that's helps understand the differences between that distal fibula extending further down relative to the medial malleolus. So consequently, in an open chain position, what tends to happen then, as I plantar flex, my foot will tend to want to roll down and in, and as I dorsiflex, it will tend to want to roll up and out. So normal range of motion then for that plantar flexion dorsiflexion motion is about 15 degrees of dorsiflexion, and down to 0, and then about 45 degrees of plantar flexion. So a right angle would be considered 0 degrees. So from that 0 degrees, I should be able to come about 15 degrees up into dorsiflexion and be able to point my toes about 45 degrees down from that position, from that 0 position. Now things start getting interesting, because now we have to look at the subtalar joint, and which is the articulation between the inferior surface of the talus and the superior surface of the calcaneus. And it's really a composite joint that's formed by 3 separate plane articulations between the talus and the calcaneus. So I have the head of the talus, which fits up against the navicular. I have the anterior articular facets. I have here, and I have the posterior articular facets. Now, the interesting thing is that this is a combination of concave and convex surfaces that are contradictory. In other words, the posterior facet here on the talus is convex with a concave surface on the calcaneus, and yet here it's convex and concave. So what is then created, if I follow my concave convex rules, is as I slide one direction, I'm going to want to roll in a different direction, and because that is occurring in this joint where I have rolling and gliding that is in contradiction to each other, the motion then becomes more of a torsion or a torque or a rotary motion that occurs where the talus wants to slide in and down on the calcaneus or up and out on the calcaneus. So that is becomes a triplanar motion occurring between these three separate plane joints. So let's see if we can get a better grasp of that, and some of that is based on what the axis of the joint motion is. So again, it's that torquing or twisting motion that's occurring, and the axis is inclined at 42 degrees from the horizontal and roughly in about 16 degrees from the sagittal plane. So there's not a tremendous amount of plantar flexion and dorsiflexion, and certainly more rotation and abduction, adduction occurring. And what's really kind of to understand it best is really to look at what's happening during subtalar joint motion in closed chain. So let's look at pronation first. So we're going to come over to the right side of my slide, and we're going to look at pronation first. And pronation occurs really when your heel hits the ground, and ground reaction force creates an eversion motion in the calcaneus. So eversion motion in the calcaneus is occurring in the frontal plane. The talus then wants to adduct. So the anterior aspect of the talus will move medially. So the posterior aspect, as seen here by my arrow, moves laterally. And at the same time, the talus will then drop down. So I have talar plantar flexion, which would be our sagittal plane motion component. I have talar adduction moving towards the midline, which would be my transverse plane component. And I have calcaneal eversion, which would be my frontal plane component. So to get the foot back up from that position, I need to look at what happens in supination. And supination is just the opposite. So now I'm still looking at a left ankle, and now the calcaneus moves into an inverted direction. The talus abducts, so the head of the talus moves back towards the midline, or away from the midline, and it draws itself back on top of the calcaneus. So the talus dorsiflexes. So that's in a closed chain motion where we have motion occurring between the subtalar joints, that composite joint that creates that twisting motion where the talus and the calcaneus are moving together. I like to look at the talocalcaneonavicular joint a little bit differently and in the same light as the subtalar joint. So the talocalcaneonavicular joint, which is kind of a mouthful, we can abbreviate that TCN joint, is really a closer to the functional link between the hind foot and the forefoot. And when I look at the axis, it's inclined 40 degrees from the transverse plane. So that's similar to the subtalar joint, but it's 30 degrees from the sagittal plane. So I have and what makes this joint different than the subtalar joint is now we've added the navicular bone and the articulation between the talus and the navicular. And that what that does is by orienting the plane 30 degrees from the sagittal plane, is I've created an axis that is moving more toward the frontal plane, which will allow greater sagittal plane motion. So this is the joint that allows our foot to really collapse down when your foot hits the ground and creates more sagittal plane motion and creates more shock absorption when our our foot hits the ground and we need to absorb the ground reaction forces coming up. So we'll see greater motion occurring at the TCN than just the subtalar joint. So the transverse tarsal joint is a compound joint formed by the talonavicular joint and the calcaneocuboid joint. So now I can take the joint and look at really what is this joint here, and this is the transverse. This is the transverse tarsal joint, and it's that joint that combines the medial column with the lateral column, and kind of looking at that S-shape orientation. The axis is similar to the subtalar joint, and the motions in the transverse tarsal joint and the subtalar joint are interdependent. So we look and see that, okay, I have inversion and or supination and pronation occurring through that transverse tarsal joint that are interdependent upon the subtalar joint. The tarsometatarsal joints look at the joints between the 5 metatarsals and the cuboid, the lateral cuneiform, the medial cuneiform, and the medial cuneiform. And their axes are twofold. And you're going to see me talk about first rays and fifth rays. An array is the metatarsal and corresponding phalange or phalanx. So it's your metatarsal and toes is what makes up the ray. So the axis of the first ray is diagonal, and it allows for that pronation, supination of the first ray coming down and in during in a plantar flexing position, and up and out whilst moving in a dorsiflex position. Same with the axis for the fifth ray is perpendicular to the axis for the first ray, which creates kind of that same rotary motion that occurs. So as the fifth ray comes down, and it comes down and in, or rolls back up and out. The third, fourth, and second, third, and fourth ray are along a frontal plane axis, and they are primarily moving in plantar flexion and dorsiflexion. So the metatarsaophalangeal joints are condyloid joints, and they provide biaxial motion in both the sagittal and transverse planes. And axis of the fifth through the second are oblique, where the axis for the first, for the hallux, is a transverse axis. So we see more pure plantar flexion, dorsiflexion at the first, where we see more of a multiplanar motion through the second, third, fourth, and fifth. Let's finish this section talking about some combined motions in the foot. And I'm going to start with an example, which is the supination twist. And a supination twist is really talking about the forefoot, and my picture here is a demonstration of the hind foot. And so really what happens is when the hind foot excessively pronates, so this is an example of a hind foot pronation. We can see from a posterior view, from an anterior view, and from a medial view. And that pronation results again from a calcaneal eversion with a talar plantar flexion and adduction, and oftentimes drives the navicular down. And the supination twist then is really a function of the forefoot, which is the response to the segments of the foot and that strong pronation in the hind foot. So when I have this strong pronation in the hind foot, the forefoot will reactively supinate when it's on the ground, and as a result, the first and the second rays dorsiflex and invert, and the fourth and the fifth rays plantar flex and evert, and that results in that supination twist. So it's really almost occurring around a longitudinal axis in the third ray, and it's just an attempt of the forefoot to adjust to the ground. And you know that the five tarsal metatarsal joints, because they have that somewhat of an independence, the configuration of the forefoot in that supination twist will vary according to the weight-bearing needs and the terrain. So that's kind of how I want to finish up talking on this first section in the foot and ankle, and we'll continue on looking at the arch and some additional motions and the muscles that drive some of those motions, and the ground reaction forces that really are responsible for the motions and the muscles countering those ground reaction forces.